Welcome, everyone. Grab a seat in the front row. If you look at the broader timeline of 1941, it's really easy to just view the Pacific and the European theaters as entirely separate fires.
Right. A war in the East and a completely distinct war in the West.
Exactly. But today I want you to step into the classroom for a masterclass on a very specific, a very tight 60-day window. We're looking at July 1st to August 31st, 1941.
And that boundary is strict because, well, those 8 weeks are the exact moment those isolated fires merged. It became an inescapable global inferno.
You're joining us to map out the sheer density of this period. We're going to see how the initial shockwaves of the Soviet Union invasion, combined with Japan's rapid expansion in the Pacific, fundamentally locked the entire planet into a truly global conflict. The fate of the 20th century literally hung in the balance right here.
The pacing is it's what makes this lesson so critical for you to understand. In just 2 months, the strategic architecture of the world was entirely rewritten. Major powers realized their pre-war math was completely wrong.
Yeah, forcing these desperate logistical scrambles.
Overnight alliances, too. But to really grasp how the world tipped over the edge, we have to look at the invisible war first, taking shape just as the visible violence was exploding.
Right, the code breakers.
Exactly. On July 9th, an entirely different kind of breakthrough happened in Britain. Alan Turing and his team achieved the mathematically impossible. They cracked the German Enigma machine messages.
Which, I mean, that fundamentally shifts the balance of power, right? Even if the guys in the trenches had no idea. Wars run on steel and fuel, sure, but they're directed by information.
It was like suddenly being able to read your opponent's playbook while they were still calling the play.
A massive invisible advantage. But simultaneously, the visible war on the Eastern Front it was expanding at a terrifying rate.
Defying all their initial projections. On July 10th, the German forces launched a massive offensive against Smolensk.
And Smolensk is basically the gateway to Moscow.
Right. The invading forces assumed the Soviet state was on the verge of a swift, total collapse like what they saw in Western Europe.
They thought they were running a sprint. And the overconfidence is, well, it's staggering. General Halder, head of the German Army High Command, he writes in his diary on July 11th,
That's just one day into the battle.
just one day, and he states that the Soviet front cannot be held and that Russian reserves existed no longer. He genuinely thought the decisive victory was already in the bag.
But you have to contrast that July 11th diary entry with the grueling reality on the ground. Smolensk was captured on July 16th, but the Soviet resistance was unbelievably fierce. The operational tempo just ground to a bloody halt.
They were dragged into a marathon. If you're enjoying this video, please watch it until the end. It helps the channel a lot and encourages us to continue our work. And that marathon, that structural resilience becomes painfully obvious when you look at Halder's writings exactly 1 month later.
Yes, the August 11th entry, his tone completely flipped.
Completely. He admitted they completely underestimated the Russian colossus. The math is it's hard to fathom. They anticipated facing roughly 200 Soviet divisions at the start.
And by August 11th, they had counted 360.
Imagine being a strategic planner. Your opponent has 160 more divisions than your absolute worst-case scenario.
Every time you break a line, a new one forms miles away. It's a logistical nightmare. And this bloody reality check immediately forced global geopolitics to realign. Ideological purity went right out the window.
Pure survival takes over,
Yeah.
which brings us to the diplomatic maneuvering. On July 12th, the UK and the USSR signed a joint action agreement in Moscow.
Pledging mutual assistance, and crucially, agreeing not to negotiate any separate peace with Germany.
Former political enemies instantly recognizing a shared reality.
And the diplomatic web expanded incredibly fast. By July 18th, the Soviet Union formalized an alliance with the Czechoslovak government in exile. Then, on July 30th, they did the exact same with the Polish government in exile.
So you have a communist state signing binding treaties with exiled capitalist and monarchist governments.
The invasion was a massive forcing function. It compressed years of diplomacy into days.
Now, while those high-level handshakes are happening in Moscow and London, a totally different kind of resistance is igniting from the ground up. I want you to look at the Balkans.
The invasion of the USSR was the spark there.
Yeah, it triggered explosive grassroots resistance across Yugoslavia throughout July. And the speed is remarkable. Let's break down the timeline for the class. July 7th, an armed uprising begins in Serbia.
Sparked by partisans in the village of Belayat Surkov.
Right. Then July 13th, uprisings erupt in Montenegro. July 22nd, it spreads to Slovenia. And July 27th, massive uprisings begin in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
In a single month, the entire region is engulfed. Ordinary people using the incredibly rugged Dinaric Alps to wage guerrilla war against mechanized forces.
Forces that were not at all equipped for mountain counterinsurgency. But the consequence of that resistance was just a devastating toll on civilians. The occupying authorities responded with mass reprisals.
Systematic terror. By August, the occupying forces in Serbia were conducting mass executions as a standard policy. On August 17th, this culminated in the public hanging of hostages right in the central square of Belgrade.
Absolute brutality. And this systemic violence echoed across Eastern Europe. Parallel to this, in Romania, the government of Ion Antonescu was accelerating its persecution and deportation of the Jewish population.
Building on the horrific massacre in Iasi that happened just weeks prior at the end of June, the sheer human cost during these 60 days shows a complete breakdown of civil order.
It really is a dark reality. The conflict eroded societal norms almost instantly. Now, to truly grasp the global scale of this lesson, we need to spin the globe. While Europe is consumed by this, the Pacific is turning into a massive powder keg.
Japan is making its moves.
Right. On July 24th, Japan fully occupies the southern portion of French Indochina.
Which is a monumental escalation. By taking southern Indochina, Japan positioned itself to threaten all of Southeast Asia, British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, the American Philippines.
A clear signal. They intended to secure the rubber, tin, and oil they desperately needed.
But the economic weapon the West deployed in response was immediate.
Devastatingly immediate. On July 26th, the United States halted trade and completely froze all Japanese assets within the U.S.,
stripping their ability to engage in international commerce.
And it culminates on August 18th. The U.S. imposes a full, comprehensive embargo on all trade with Japan. They attached a massive condition, a total withdrawal of all Japanese troops from China and Indochina.
You really have to look at the underlying math here. Japan relied on the United States for 80% of its oil supply.
Right, so when you cut off 80% of a modern military's oil, you're starting a countdown clock.
Exactly. The Imperial Japanese Navy couldn't sail, the Air Force couldn't fly, the domestic economy would freeze in months, Tokyo was backed into a corner.
They had a binary choice: abandon their imperial ambitions and withdraw from China,
which the military leadership saw as a total loss of face,
or fight to secure new oil reserves in the Dutch East Indies.
And moving on, the Dutch East Indies meant war with the U.S. and Britain. It was guaranteed.
The U.S. knew how tightly they were squeezing, and Japan knew time was running out. The tension in August was just palpable. And this deteriorating situation in the Pacific, colliding with the bloodshed in the East, meant leaders were frantically planning for a future that was shifting beneath their feet.
Which brings us to a really cinematic moment. Between August 9th and August 14th, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill hold a highly classified meeting.
Not in a bunker. At sea.
Aboard heavily armed warships in the freezing waters of Placentia Bay off the coast of Newfoundland.
The optics are incredible. The leader of an empire fighting for its life and a leader of a legally neutral nation meeting at sea to draft a blueprint for the post-war world.
The result was the Atlantic Charter, issued on August 14th. It's a foundational document. Even though the U.S. wasn't formally in the war, they were jointly defining their goals.
Calling for self-determination of all peoples, no territorial gains, global economic cooperation.
And explicitly calling for the final destruction of Nazi tyranny. It laid the ideological groundwork for the United Nations.
The profound statement of shared democratic values. But, and this is a big but for the class to consider, there's a sharp contrast between high-minded ideals and the pragmatic, morally complex reality of winning a war.
Right. To show the truly global scale of the chessboard, look at one final action at the end of August. On August 25th, British and Soviet forces launched a joint military invasion of Iran.
Iran was a sovereign, neutral country at the time, not an active combatant. So why do the Allies invade neutral territory?
Pure logistics. Unadulterated strategic necessity. The Soviet Union was taking catastrophic losses. They desperately needed industrial supplies and military equipment from the West.
And getting those supplies there was a nightmare. The northern sea routes to Murmansk were treacherous ice, U-boats, the Luftwaffe.
The Allies needed a secure backdoor, the Persian corridor.
So by invading Iran, they secured a high-volume overland route, using the Trans-Iranian Railway to funnel millions of tons of equipment from the Persian Gulf straight into the southern Soviet Union.
And it neutralized any potential German espionage in Tehran, securing the Middle Eastern oil fields. Establishing that corridor was essential to keeping the Soviet war machine alive, But,
It required invading a neutral nation to do it.
yeah,
When you map out the density of what we've covered today, it's almost overwhelming. You've just walked through 60 of the most volatile days in human history.
July 1st to August 31st, 1941, the geopolitical landscape completely shattered.
The myth of swift invincibility died in Smolensk. Turing quietly broke uncrackable codes. Opposing ideologies forged desperate alliances. The Balkans erupted, triggering horrific reprisals. The U.S. economically cornered Japan.
Yeah.
And the blueprint for a democratic world was drafted on a battleship right alongside the invasion of a neutral country to secure supply lines.
The velocity of these events forces us to confront the mechanics of total war. Before we dismiss class, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. Consider the contradictions of this window.
The Atlantic Charter champions self-determination and no territorial expansion.
Yet, survival required aligning with nations that had their own histories of expansion, and defeating tyranny meant actively invading neutral Iran. It forces a tough question. When your survival is on the line, how much of your morality are you willing to negotiate to secure the logistics of victory?
If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell to be notified about new videos, click the like button, and share the video with your colleagues, as this helps us maintain the channel. Thank you.